There's a photograph that shouldn't exist, taken in 1912 in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. It shows a family reunion of the Fugate clan. 43 people gathered around a weathered farmhouse, their faces bearing an impossible shade of blue, not painted blue, not bruised blue, born blue, their skin the color of a winter sky, their lips darker than midnight. The photographer's hand trembled as he captured what locals had whispered about for generations, but never dared to document. This wasn't a medical anomaly that struck once and disappeared. This was the result of something far more deliberate, far more disturbing. 3 centuries of bloodlines twisted back on themselves like a serpent devouring its own tail. 300 years of cousins marrying cousins, of brothers taking sisters as wives, of a family tree that had grown not outward toward the light, but inward into darkness so complete that nature itself rebelled. The Fugate family of Troublesome Creek didn't just live in isolation, they were isolation. Cut off from the world not by mountains or rivers, but by choices made in the shadow of shame, generation after generation. What began as necessity became obsession. What started as survival became something that challenged the very foundations of human genetics. Tonight, we descend into the hollow where the blue people lived. We'll trace the bloodline that became so tangled it created its own medical impossibility. We'll walk through graveyards where the headstones tell stories of marriages that were never meant to be, of children born carrying the weight of their ancestors' sins in their very blood. This is the story of America's most inbred family, a tale so disturbing that even today, nearly a century after that photograph was taken, the mountain people still speak of the Fugates in hushed tones. Some secrets are buried in the earth, others are carried high, and the blood passed down like a curse that grows stronger with each generation. The blue skin was just the beginning. What we've uncovered about the Fugate family tree will make you question everything you thought you knew about the hidden corners of American history. Welcome to the hollow where nature's laws were broken and the price was paid in blue blood. The story begins in 1820 when Martin Fugate arrived in the remote hills of eastern Kentucky. He carried with him a secret written in his very DNA, a recessive gene that lay dormant, waiting. Martin wasn't blue. He appeared normal, healthy, a typical frontiersman seeking land where no questions would be asked. But the blood that flowed through his veins carried the blueprint for something that would haunt his descendants for generations. Martin married Elizabeth Smith, a woman whose pale complexion hid the same genetic time bomb. Neither knew what they carried. Neither understood that their union would birth not just children, but a medical mystery that would perplex doctors for over a century. Their first child, Zachariah, emerged from the womb with skin the color of a bruise. The midwife nearly dropped him, crossing herself and whispering prayers she'd learned for warding off demons. But Zachariah lived. And as the years passed, more blue children followed. The community, already suspicious of outsiders, began to whisper. Some called it divine punishment. Others believed the family had made a pact with darker forces. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying. Martin and Elizabeth had unknowingly created the perfect genetic storm. In the isolation of Troublesome Creek, where the nearest neighbor lived miles away and the outside world felt like another planet, the Fugate family faced a choice. They could leave, scatter to distant towns where their blue children might find spouses with different blood, or they could stay turning inward, marrying within the clan to keep their secret contained. They chose isolation. They chose secrecy. They chose each other. By 1850, the pattern was established. Fugate cousins married Fugate cousins. The gene pool, already shallow, became a puddle. With each generation, the blue grew deeper, more pronounced. Children born with skin seen. Oh, dark, they appeared otherworldly. The family cemetery filled with small headstones, many marking lives cut short by complications that modern medicine would later link to severe inbreeding. The mountain people learned to avoid the Fugate hollow after sunset. They spoke of strange sounds echoing through the trees, of blue figures moving like ghosts among the shadows. What they didn't know was that the Fugates were creating something unprecedented in American history, a family so genetically isolated that they were evolving backward, becoming less human with each passing generation. By 1880, the Fugate family tree had become something no botanist would recognize. Branches that should have grown apart had twisted together, creating knots that defied nature's design. Zachariah Fugate, the first blue child, married his own cousin. Their children married each other. Aunts became wives, uncles became fathers-in-law. The distinction between relative and spouse had blurred beyond recognition. The records that survive from this period read like a genealogist's nightmare. Birth certificates list fathers who were also grandfathers, mothers who were simultaneously sisters and wives. The courthouse clerk in Hazard, Kentucky, began requiring double documentation for Fugate marriages, unable to believe that families could become so entangled. One marriage license from 1883 shows that the bride and groom shared not just the same last name, but the same 4 grandparents. Luna Fugate, born in 1888, represented the pinnacle of this genetic concentration. Her parents were double first cousins. Their fathers were brothers, their mothers were sisters. Luna's skin was so blue it appeared purple in certain light. But it wasn't just her appearance that marked her as different. Luna never learned to speak properly, communicating mostly in grunts and gestures. Her spine curved unnaturally, forcing her to walk hunched over like something emerging from a cave. She lived to be 91, a walking testament to what happens when human bloodlines become too pure. The family developed their own language of sorts, a mixture of broken English and sounds that seemed to bypass human vocal cords entirely. They understood each other perfectly, but outsiders found their speech nearly incomprehensible. It was as if they were becoming their own species, adapted to the darkness of their hollow and the suffocating closeness of their shared blood. Children born to the Fugates in this era faced challenges beyond just their blue skin. Heart defects were common, mental disabilities ran through the family like a river, many died in infancy, their tiny bodies unable to sustain life with blood so concentrated, so lacking in genetic diversity. The family cemetery expanded yearly, filled with small graves that marked not just individual deaths, but the slow death of human genetic potential. Yet still they continued. Still they married within the clan. The outside world had ceased to exist for them entirely. They had become prisoners of their own blood, trapped in a cycle of reproduction that grew more dangerous with each generation. The turn of the 20th century brought no relief to the Fugate bloodline. If anything, the isolation deepened. By 1900, there were over 200 blue-skinned Fugates scattered across the hollows of eastern Kentucky, but their world had shrunk to the size of a few mountain ridges. They had created their own ecosystem of genetic horror, where normal human reproduction had become biologically impossible. Dr. Madison Cawein would later document what he found when he first encountered the Fugates in 1960. His medical notes, preserved in the University of Kentucky archives, read like something from a horror novel. Children with 11 fingers, adults whose hearts beat irregularly because the muscle had developed abnormally in the womb, women who gave birth to babies that lived only hours, their bodies too damaged by genetic repetition to sustain life. But perhaps most disturbing was what the family had become psychologically. They moved differently than normal humans, slower, more deliberately, as if their thoughts had to travel through thick blood to reach their limbs. They rarely made eye contact, even with each other. When they spoke, which was infrequently, their voices carried a flat, emotionless quality that suggested something fundamental had been lost in their genetic compression. The family had developed rituals around death that revealed how normalized genetic failure had become. When babies were born with severe deformities, they weren't mourned in the traditional sense. Instead, the family would gather in silent acceptance, as if such tragedies were as natural as the changing seasons. They had learned to expect the worst from their own blood, and their blood rarely disappointed them. Local doctors refused to treat the Fugates after 1905, when Dr. Samuel Morrison examined a newborn and documented that the child possessed characteristics he had never seen in modern medical literature. The baby's blood was so thick with concentrated genetics that it moved sluggishly through tiny veins. Morrison burned his notes and never spoke of the examination again, but his assistant later revealed that the doctor had nightmares for months afterward. The Fugates had reached a point where they were no longer quite human, but they weren't dead either. They existed in a liminal space, sustained by genetics so inbred that they had created their own biological category. They were living proof that some boundaries should never be crossed, some genetic lines should never be blurred beyond recognition. By 1950, the Fugate family had become something that shouldn't exist in nature. 5 generations of continuous inbreeding had created biological impossibilities. Children born with organs on the wrong side of their bodies, adults whose bones grew at impossible angles, creating limbs that functioned but looked like they belonged to different species entirely. The blue skin, which had once been their most distinctive feature, was now the least disturbing aspect of their genetic reality. Benjamin Fugate, born in 1943, represented the culmination of this genetic experiment gone wrong. His parents were siblings. His grandparents were cousins who were also aunt and nephew. His family tree was less a tree than a telephone pole, straight up and down, with no branches extending outward. Benjamin's blood was so genetically concentrated that when he cut himself, the wound would barely bleed. His circulation had slowed to the point where his heart beat only 40 times per minute, yet somehow he lived to be 67. The family had developed their own medical practices, passed down through generations of genetic disasters. They knew which herbs could ease the breathing problems that plagued most blue children. They understood how to set bones that grew crooked from birth. They had learned to deliver babies that might survive despite carrying the accumulated genetic damage of centuries. They had become experts in managing their own biological breakdown. But perhaps most haunting was how normal this had all become to them. When children were born with severe disabilities, the family showed no surprise, no grief. They had accepted that their bloodline produced monsters, and they continued breeding anyway. They had chosen genetic purity over genetic health, and by 1950, that choice had created a family that existed outside the normal boundaries of human biology. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have broken the cycle, or would the weight of tradition have trapped you too? The answer matters more than you might think, because by the 1950s, the Fugates weren't just a medical curiosity. They had become a warning about what happens when human beings prioritize blood purity above all else. They were living proof that some genetic experiments should never be conducted, some family traditions should never be continued. The beginning of the end came in 1960, when Dr. Madison Cowan arrived in the hills of eastern Kentucky on a mission that would expose the Fugate family to the outside world for the first time in over a century. Cowan had heard rumors of the Blue People, stories passed down through generations of mountain folk who claimed to have seen families with skin the color of midnight. Most doctors dismissed these tales as folklore, but Cowan was different. He believed that somewhere in those mountains lay answers to genetic questions that mainstream medicine was afraid to ask. What he found shattered everything he thought he knew about human genetics. In a remote hollow near Troublesome Creek, he discovered not just 1 or 2 blue individuals, but an entire family system that had turned inbreeding into an art form. The Fugates didn't just marry cousins, they had created a closed genetic loop where every member of the family was related to every other member in multiple ways simultaneously. Cowan's documentation revealed the true scope of the genetic damage. He found families where the average IQ had dropped below 70, children born with hearts that had only 3 chambers instead of 4, adults whose skeletal systems had developed so abnormally that they couldn't stand upright. The blue skin, he realized, was merely the visible manifestation of genetic destruction that ran much deeper than appearance. But most disturbing to Cowan was the family's reaction to his presence. They weren't ashamed of their condition, they were proud of it. They spoke of their blue skin as a mark of purity, a sign that their bloodline hadn't been contaminated by outsiders. They had convinced themselves that their genetic isolation made them superior, even as their bodies proved the opposite with each generation. The doctor's notes, sealed for decades due to their disturbing content, reveal a family that had crossed a line from which there could be no return. By 1960, the Fugates possessed DNA so concentrated, so repeatedly folded back on itself, that they had essentially created their own subspecies. They were the end result of what happens when human beings reject genetic diversity in favor of genetic purity, and the result was a family that barely qualified as human anymore. Colwyn left the mountains changed forever. His final report, submitted to the medical journal but never published, contained a warning that reads like prophecy. What I found in those hills represents not just a medical anomaly, but a glimpse into humanity's darkest genetic possibilities. Today, the last of the blue Fugates are gone. Benjamin Fugate died in 2009, taking with him the final visible reminder of what 3 centuries of inbreeding could create. But the story doesn't end with his death. It echoes through the mountains of Kentucky like a ghost that refuses to rest. The hollow where the blue people lived still stands empty, their abandoned houses slowly being reclaimed by the forest, as if nature itself is trying to erase the evidence of what happened there. The genetic legacy of the Fugates extends far beyond their blue skin. Modern genealogical research has revealed that their bloodline, concentrated through centuries of intermarriage, created genetic markers that appear nowhere else in human history. They had become a closed genetic experiment, a family that evolved in isolation until they were no longer entirely human. Scientists who study their preserved DNA samples speak in hushed tones about what they've discovered, genetic combinations so impossible they challenge our understanding of human reproduction. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Fugate story is how easily it could happen again. In our modern world of genetic testing and medical awareness, we tell ourselves that such extreme inbreeding is impossible, yet isolated communities still exist, religious groups that marry only within their faith, families that prioritize bloodline purity above genetic health. The Fugates weren't an anomaly. They were a warning about what happens when human beings choose genetic isolation over genetic diversity. The mountain people say that on certain nights, when the fog rolls through Troublesome Creek, you can still see blue figures moving through the trees. Ghosts of a family that pushed human genetics beyond its breaking point. Spirits of children who were born carrying the weight of their ancestors' choices in their very blood. The locals don't go near the old Fugate homestead after dark, claiming that the land itself remembers what was done there. The Fugates created something that science is still struggling to understand, a family so genetically concentrated that they existed at the very edge of human possibility. They were the end result of what happens when blood purity becomes more important than genetic health, when family tradition matters more than the welfare of future generations. They were America's most inbred family, and their legacy serves as a warning that echoes through time. Some secrets should stay buried, some genetic lines should be allowed to end. The blue people of Kentucky proved that there are boundaries in human genetics that should never be crossed, consequences that last for generations, and prices that are paid not just by those who make the choices, but by every child born into their bloodline. Their story ends not with redemption, but with extinction, the only mercy that genetics could finally offer to a family that had asked too much of their own blood.